Thank you very much for coming this evening. I'm so sorry about the rescheduling from a couple of weeks ago. COVID got in the way, but I'm perfectly well now. You'll be pleased to know, though I do notice that we have someone in a mask here, but it's not because of me. No, you're not sick. This is our first Q&A for 2024. We usually hold 2 or 3 throughout the year, so keep your eyes open, and there will be more coming on a variety of topics. So at the outset, I would like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we gather, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I think it's particularly pertinent that we acknowledge First Nations people tonight because, tragically, in cancer, First Nations people actually usually get higher rates of cancer and the more difficult to treat cancers. And that study's been going on for about 25 years here at the Perkins with Professor Redfern. So it is a really poignant acknowledgement that we keep Aboriginal people in mind this evening. Tonight's topic, on that rather sombre note, Peter, let me introduce Peter Leedman, the CEO of the Harry Perkins Institute of Medical Research. And Peter, tonight we're going to be discussing your vision for cancer care or delivering a better type of cancer care in Western Australia. You're an endocrinologist, a hormone specialist, not an oncologist, but you obviously see patients still in your busy working week. But you're a researcher, and most pertinent, you're a cancer researcher here at the Harry Perkins. So in that whole mix of things that you are, what particularly drives you to want to produce a better delivery of cancer care in WA?
Miriam, thank you for that question. I was reminded today I was at Royal Perth in my clinic, and I love our public health system and the way we deliver cancer care. But what we're going to talk about tonight is maybe a different way of thinking about it and delivering it in a way that we don't currently. So I think that the answer to your question is quite multifaceted, and what we'll do as the evening goes on is talk more about comprehensive cancer care and how we can do it differently. We have 2 extraordinary events in the Institute. One is the Walk for Women's Cancer that was held last Saturday, which was wildly successful. And we have our ride for the Macca 200 Ride for Cancer. And over the years, and both have been going for over 10 years, I've had an incredible opportunity to talk to literally thousands of people. And the stories that they've been able to tell, and in fact love telling me about, is their cancer journey. And the cancer journey is not infrequently incredibly fragmented. The care we deliver in Western Australia is top shelf, but the journey can be incredibly difficult. And so, Miriam, as I said, this is one part of this question. It's a really important, and maybe it's a really lovely segue into various other questions and other things we're going to talk about. But fragmented journeys really is very challenging for the person.
Can you describe what you mean by a fragmented journey?
Yeah. So if I think of any of the stories that I've heard over the last 15 years, patients will be diagnosed with cancer and then they may need to go to many different places across the town. And it's often really challenging to find the right place, find the right doctors, get the right thing done in the right time and the right order. It's incredibly challenging. If the diagnosis of cancer is given to you, the world stops in real terms. Everything stops, and you're incredibly focused on your own health. And so I think fragmented journeys is a very common part of this challenging journey that people have when they've been given a diagnosis of cancer. Can it be better? Well, it can be, and there are various ways of doing that, one of which we're going to talk about this morning, or this evening I should say, is within the confines of a comprehensive cancer centre, a true comprehensive cancer centre. We're going to talk more about that and the vision that we have in the Perkins for that entity.
Because you're right, obviously a diagnosis of cancer is extraordinarily overwhelming, and you just talked about the need to go and have various tests and scans and screens and appointments and keeping track of all of those medical elements. But what about things like even seeking pain management or the holistic care or the physiotherapy or the financial help or the complementary? You know, how does a patient navigate all of that at the moment?
So I think it can be very challenging indeed. And if we look at examples and models around the world, there are, as it were, one-stop shop options. Looking across Australia, the Peter MacCallum, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre or the Chris O'Brien Cancer Centre in Sydney. And it's relatively simple, but it's really, really important to provide everything under one roof. And what does that actually mean? Well, it could well mean a diagnosis, treatment, surgery, ICU, beds, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, under one roof. And that's not to the exclusion of all of the rest of the cancer care in Western Australia. Of course, a new centre can't cope with all of that, but it can value add and be a guiding light and a shining light in the town. And that's the goal, and we'll talk more about this and unfold it and unpack it as the evening goes on.
So when you've talked to and listened to we have 3,000 people, for example, involved in those two events that you referred to, and either they've had a cancer experience or their family members have, at the moment, is it quite varied, the experience? Some have quite well-coordinated cancer journeys, some less so. Is that what you're really hearing?
Absolutely. So I've got to be really clear to everyone. You know, I'm a doctor, I work in the public health system, and we have fantastic medicine in Western Australia. This is not about, in any way, commenting on the quality of our care. But it's a new way, it's a different way of developing it. And around the world, there are some fantastic models of delivering care in a one-stop shop concept, and that's whether you look at the US, Europe, the UK. There are some wonderful models, and there's some opportunities for us to adopt those models and deliver care in a different way than we currently do.
Before we get further into that description of the vision, just tell me at the moment, cancer statistics. Cancer, is it shrinking or growing?
Unfortunately, cancer is growing. In this town, it's about 3 to 5% per year. So over a 5-year period, there's likely to be a 20% increase in the demand for cancer care. And as you probably all know, it's jam-packed, stretched at the present time in the hospital sector. Getting appointments for scans, getting appointments to see your doctor, it's really busy. The care's really good, but the accessing it is very challenging. And I think that's a very common experience for most people in this room if you've had to negotiate those challenging areas. So there's an opportunity to provide a new way of doing, as it were, business, and to help overcome the challenges that we currently have with our health system being absolutely jam-packed. What can we do? What can we provide that might cater for those 20% extra people that we're going to have in our town by 2029? And
cancer, of course, is the leading cause of death by disease for adults, and there's significant disparity, isn't there, between regional and people in our cities, in our major centres. There's a really big difference, isn't there, between...
Absolutely. So we know, unfortunately, that if you are having your cancer care outside of the metropolitan centres, then your chance of, one, being involved in clinical trials is almost zero, and two, over time, your mortality is substantially increased. And this has been a really substantial issue for the government and for all of us thinking about how we might be able to deliver cancer care to the regions. I mean, we live in a huge state and we want equity for everyone. And it's a very simple concept. do we deliver that at the present time? It's incredibly difficult. Just think, if you're on a farm, one of my patients today is a farmer, and she has thyroid cancer, and the difficulties of her negotiating the trip to come down to have various therapies is not inconsiderable. And what a lot of people don't do, they don't travel, or if they travel, they've got 6 weeks of therapy, often without family, without the people they really want to be close to and be held by. All the things that we can deliver when we're in the same town. So the things that we might take for granted, let alone the fragmentation we've just mentioned, is really challenging in the regions. And this is a huge issue for all of us because of the mortality rate being so much higher than it is if you have cancer in the city. We don't have the answer yet, but clearly there are some thoughts for how we might be able to improve that.
And with this growth in cancer, what did you say, 20%, which is quite a staggering...
Over 5 years.
Over 5 years, quite a staggering figure. How are our hospitals coping, public and private?
As I mentioned, I think it's very, very busy and very little room for expansion and increasing capacity. And that's a fact. And if you look around the whole of Australia in the public health system, to some extent very similar in the private sector, but I've been a public hospital doctor for 30 years, it's incredibly busy. If any of you want to try and get an appointment, it's challenging to do so. It's challenging to get scans done, let alone being operated on. So the system's incredibly good, but incredibly stretched. And what other model might there be for us to overcome the problems of capacity and also to provide quaternary care that recognises the importance of research to underpin the delivery of cancer care, and I really mean underpin it and integrate it, and we'll talk more about that going forward, because these comprehensive cancer centres, the true contemporary cancer centres around the world, they have research that truly underpins the development and the delivery of clinical care. And we'll talk more about what I really mean by that. But when I visited some centres around the world just recently, they are incredibly proud of their ability to do incredibly high quality fundamental discovery research that leads to translational studies, clinical trials, and leads to clinical care at the bedside. And that continuum is incredibly important if we're going to develop into a world-class centre for cancer care. And I'll talk more about that because it's a great passion.
I will jump onto research while you're here and just talk about I've heard you talk about that there's sort of an evolution in research. So if someone's cancer journey is, say, 12 or 15 years long, what sort of changes in research are happening which could impact a patient?
Right. So technology is allowing incredible advances in the biology of cancer and the application of that to new therapeutics. It's galloping along at an incredibly fast rate. If you think about the technologies that were involved in the mRNA vaccines for COVID, and many of you have been vaccinated, that happened with an incredible pace. Well, think much the same in cancer. And in fact, the research is to some extent not lagging behind, but is way ahead, because converting that into therapies and getting the Path West and the governments to take on the research is in fact a challenge. It's all moving at a great rate. So how do you keep up? How do you actually deliver the care and deliver the research that's going to improve the care? It's actually a massive challenge. You can do that when you've got centres of excellence. You can do that when you've got clinical trials, you've got people who are world's best, you're attracting the best, you're retaining the best people, and you're delivering care in a way that we currently don't, which is quaternary care, which is truly based on high quality research. The number of people, for example, who are involved in clinical trials with cancer is depressingly small. It's only about 5% of people who have cancer who actually get into clinical trials. Yet we know that clinical trials entry and participation brings improved outcomes, incredibly close supervision by the clinical trials team, and we just desperately need more resources, more people, and the capacity to deliver clinical trials to as many people as humanly possible. The larger centres have the resources to pour into that, to move that dial from 5 to 7 to 10%. Wouldn't it be marvellous if we were like children with cancer, almost 95% of kids with cancer going to a clinical trial. And it's almost the complete reverse for adults. So this is a huge aspirational goal because we know the outcomes are better, participation rates really do drive better outcomes here, and we know it. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of our pet loves, which is linear clinical research, which is owned and run by the Perkins, which does spectacular early phase clinical trials, and it's world best. I can talk more about linear if you'd like me to.
Well, you can. I was wanting to talk about TIL therapy, but you can talk about linear.
Well, I'll come back to talk about TIL therapy. But about 14 years ago, the state government very kindly donated $9.5 million to the Harry Perkins Institute to start linear clinical research. And we took great note of other centres in Australia where they were expert at doing clinical trials, and we decided that for our population in Western Australia, if we could provide early phase clinical trials, we could get many more people on that continuum towards improved care.
And sorry, can you explain early phase?
And early phase is first in human. So in linear, which is now 62 beds on 2 sites here and at Joondalup, about half of the work that linear does is for cancer, and about half of the work is for non-cancer, new drugs for anaesthetics, blood pressure, medications, etc. But in the cancer component of linear, there are about 60 open for registration clinical trials where there is a drug that's been developed somewhere in the world, and that's gone into someone for the very first time in linear in Western Australia. And last year, something like 120 patients in Western Australia received a medication in linear first in world. And that is spectacular when you think about it, because that means in Perth, somewhat isolated place in the world, we are giving patients access to a drug first in world. Not infrequently, linear would be one of 3 huge research organisations, Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, that I visited a while ago, MD Anderson in Texas, best in world, huge organisations, and the 3rd place that the trial might be undertaken is in linear. And we're very proud of that for the community. So who are the beneficiaries here? It's us, it's the community, because we want to be able to give to our patients a drug first in human, because the time between that drug being given to someone first in human and the next phase, the second phase clinical trial, could be too long for that person. So we're passionate about bringing clinical trials to Western Australia. We're passionate about increasing that. And how do we do that? Well, within the confines of a comprehensive cancer centre, you can expand Linear's capacity to grow and delivery of first-in-human clinical trials.
I think that's exactly where we're going to go. Your vision is for what's called a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre. And let's just stay with the research element. How do you integrate research? Because that's what I understand a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre has, is it has the integration of research in with patient treatment plans. How does that work?
So if you're a patient with cancer, what we're talking about is starts at the very beginning. And as the patient comes into the centre, they're going to be chaperoned, as it were, wayfinded. All aspects of their clinical care are in one place, and we've talked a little bit about that earlier. It's incredibly easy for the journey, for them and their loved ones. If there's a need for an operation, there's theatres. If there's a need for ICU, there's an ICU. If there's a need for beds, which there would be, something like 100 150 beds. If there's a need for radiotherapy, there's radiotherapy. If there's a need for chemotherapy, there's a chemotherapy suite. There's all of the things that make care holistic. There could be physiotherapy, there could be music therapy, there could be a suite, as it were, of alternative and complementary therapies. The goal is to make it easy for patients. The goal is to provide world's best care. The goal is to recruit the best people to deliver that. The goal is to have research underpin every aspect of that. So there's the journey. How does research play a part in addition to clinical trials? Well, the best centres in the world, they have this huge juggernaut of discovery-based research that sits right next to and integrates with clinical care. And what do I mean by that? To some extent, you can think of clinical care and cure. The clinical services we have in Western Australia are fantastic and they deliver great care. If you think about cure, it's about fundamental discovery research underpinning the discovery of new drugs, the discovery of new ways of diagnosing cancer, the discovery of making sure that this patient gets the right drug, and that's dependent upon high-quality research that has matched the patient with the right drug and the right therapy. So this is an aspirational goal that we haven't quite got to yet because the technology hasn't really been able to be matched really super well with the patients. But it's coming at an incredible rate. And if you look around the world, the very best and most prestigious comprehensive cancer centres or contemporary comprehensive cancer centres have this, as I said, juggernaut of research that integrates into clinical care and in a way that is best in the world. And so it establishes what we would call quaternary research centres inside the facility.
So are you talking about, say, individual patient tissue banks, tissue samples,
Absolutely.
analysis at a molecular level?
Absolutely. So a beautiful example is a large liver cancer program that's happening here, right here in Western Australia. Almost every single liver cancer that has been diagnosed, we are obtaining tissue from patients with ethics, of course. That tissue is undergoing an intensive attack, as it were, to understand the genetic fingerprint that each cancer has. And then the goal, of course, is to match that genetic fingerprint that is becoming more and more refined with time with the patient and match that patient with the genetic fingerprint with the best outcome treatment. And right now, that technology is being developed and being translated into patient care, but it's got a long way to go. Currently, there are little chips for the diagnosis of cancer that might have 250 different cancer genes on them. We're talking 20,000 genes in the human genome, and soon we would want to increase that to thousands upon thousands of genes on the chips so that we can match better the molecular fingerprint of the tumour with the patient. That's the goal, and we've got a long way to go yet, but big centres can do this faster and deliver it in a much more precise way to the patients.
So when we talk about multidisciplinary teams, so the patient comes in, their diagnosis takes place, it's not just with one oncologist, but it might be including research information at that point of diagnosis?
Absolutely. Great example is the melanoma MDT, multidisciplinary team meeting that happens in the Perkins, and complex and difficult melanoma patients' tumours are reviewed, all their clinical information is reviewed. It's almost like putting the patient in the middle of the table and all of the relevant information for them around the table is discussed by a multidisciplinary team of oncologists, haematologists, surgeons, plastic surgeons, pathologists, radiologists, because you want as many brains around the table when your cancer is being considered as humanly possible. And I think that's the goal. We have lots of MDTs already in Perth, but it's not everywhere. And in the larger centres, in the contemporary cancer centres, every single patient is part of an MDT. And that is a given, as it were. Every single patient is looked at, every single clinical trial that's humanly possible for them to enter into. So there's increased resources, increased capacity, of course, and that leads with time to improved outcomes. So better journey and improved outcomes. And that's the goal, of course. If you look at the US and in Europe, in the US there's the National Cancer Institute, which is a large single body operating out of Washington, and there's a whole network across the US of cancer centres delivering the sort of care that we're talking about. Fundamental research, fueling and driving a wonderful access to clinical trials and then into clinical care.
When you mentioned melanoma, can I come back to what I wanted to talk about, which was TIL therapy? And the reason I wanted to mention it is because for the first time, I think this year it will happen, a Perth patient will be able to be the first person to experience this, and this is for a melanoma patient. But it's another example, isn't it, of research and patient connection. So can you give a layperson's description of that?
There's a lovely example in melanoma happening right here in Perth. And this is for advanced melanoma, so which has a not great outcome and prognosis. Even with immunotherapy, which has made a big difference to the outcome in advanced melanoma, we've still got a long way to go. So Professor Jonas Nilsson, who's part of the Harry Perkins, who's a melanoma expert, is working with a number of other collaborators at Royal Perth Hospital in the cell and tissue area of the hospital. And what Jonas is doing, he's taking a type of cell out of the patient, and they are called tissue infiltrating lymphocytes, or TILs. And he's removing TILs from the patients, he's spinning them down, and then he's supercharging them. He's basically instilling into these little TILs, which are designed to fight the cancer, he's supercharging them, and then the goal is, and this will start early in the new year or maybe late this year, is to put them back into the patient, and these TILs will target the advanced melanoma cells. This hasn't been done yet in Australia. It's a very complex, it's a form of what we call cell therapy or T-cell therapy, and if it's successful, it would be a wonderful outcome. But it's a beautiful example of cutting-edge technology, collaboration, working together and providing for our patients in Western Australia a new way of doing business, which would be very exciting.
When we're talking about integrating research into patient diagnosis and treatment plans, we're not just talking about Perkins research, because there are some elements of research that obviously don't happen here. What other areas in Perth do you know of at the moment who would be keen to be part of a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre to integrate their research in?
Yeah. So great question. So we have in Western Australia some substantial centres of excellence. Many of you might know Bruce Robinson and the team here at Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital. They do world-class research in lung cancer and mesothelioma. A bit like melanoma is the Australian cancer, as it were, or shared with New Zealand at times. Mesothelioma is unfortunately very prevalent due to Whitnam and all of the asbestosis issues. So that's a world-class team, and again, if we were to bring to fruition a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre to Western Australia, teams like that, headed by Bruce Robinson and others, who've got incredible experience along this whole continuum from the diagnosis, new technologies, translating that into new early therapies, clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and into clinical care. Similarly, there are fantastic expertise in various types of ovarian cancer, various types of, of breast cancer, and in another fantastic area of strength in this town is in haematological and what we call lymphoma or blood-type cancers. So we've got some awesome research happening in this town, and again, there are opportunities, would be opportunities in a comprehensive cancer centre, a contemporary version of that, to fill up the research with very high-quality people from this town who have come here, like Jonas Nilsson from Gothenburg in Sweden, and lots of other places around the world. It is becoming a centre of excellence, which I'm very excited about.
You've just been around the world looking at a couple of comprehensive cancer centres. Where did you go?
So I went to New York to visit Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Centre, which is about 100 years old, has 500 beds. It is a fantastic place to visit. There is a huge cancer research juggernaut delivering incredible things into their cancer continuum. They have a fantastic clinical trials facility and delivery of care facility right next to the hospital and the research entity. So, and there's something very special about co-locating all of these things in the one space, either in one single building or literally having them next door to each other. So at Memorial Sloan Kettering, you literally walk across the road and there's the hospital, and on the other side of the hospital, other side of the road, I should say, is this incredible research factory. And they're proud. They're really proud about their research and their fundamental discovery research towards a cure. And again, if you just simplistically think about cancer cure versus care, the cure is about the research, fundamental research that drives you towards improved cancer care. So Memorial Sloan Kettering is incredible in all aspects, both of the basic science discovery, but also clinical trials and clinical care. Interestingly enough, they don't have anything like Linear, our clinical trials facility. It was fascinating to find out. They were very interested in finding more about how we've developed Linear into really a very high quality, internationally branded clinical trials facility.
But you also went to Calgary, and that fascinated me, and I was wondering if that was because, you know, the provinces of Canada are enormous, as is the state of Western Australia. Did you see things in the centre in Calgary which gave you an insight as to how we might be able to overcome the inequities and the disparities because of the tyranny of distance for patients who are scattered across Western Australia?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the province that Calgary's in is pretty big in Canada, and Canada, as you know, is huge. So there are a number of very interesting things. Don Morris is the CEO of the just about finished large contemporary comprehensive cancer centre. And what's special about that? Well, it's going to service a large amount of the province, but it's networked across the province already. And that's really important, that any contemporary comprehensive cancer centre in this country, it's wonderfully networked with the current cancer care that's there. It's not predatorising it in any way, shape or form. It's going to value add to what's being provided, which is really, really important. They've got massive issues in the province just by virtue of it being huge, and they're exactly the same things that we were talking about earlier on about, you know, our state being huge from the point of view of equity, and how do we really truly make a difference to the outcomes for someone who's in Broome. I was communicating with one of my patients today who's in Broome, and I was just thinking about it's really challenging. I hadn't realised she was actually in Broome rather than in Perth, but she was. So these are big issues, and they are trying to face them. They're trying to think about how to spread the care, improve equity, have nodes across the whole province, which I imagine that we would too, but link those nodes so the delivery of clinical trials, for example, could increase. In Western Australia, I'm not quite sure if you realise that there's clinical trials virtually almost restricted to the urban areas, and it's very challenging to actually conduct cancer clinical trials outside of Perth, which is an added massive problem. So they face in Calgary and in the province much the same as we do. What was really interesting was to look at a virtually finished contemporary cancer centre. Research is embedded into it. There are multiple floors, literally right in the middle of the building. The pathology services are right in the middle of the building, and they also don't have anything like Linear. It's amazing, and they were also fascinated by the fact that we had a true, really high quality, first in human clinical trials facility right here in Perth, and they didn't know about it. and they were fascinated and very keen to understand how we developed it and why it's so special.
What about telehealth, tele-oncology? Is that what we would envisage in Western Australia if we did build this thing?
Yeah. So there's already fantastic tele-oncology. And what do I mean by that? That means delivering cancer care into the rural sector. It's challenging because medications and chemotherapies and other sorts of treatments for cancer can have a broad set of side effects. So you need on the ground the people who can deliver the care, and you need really great communication channels between us, as it were, in Perth and the rest of the state. But the goal, of course, is to have fantastic tele-oncology and to allow that to happen in the most rural and remote areas in Western Australia, and Australia for that matter. But at the same time, work out how we can deliver safely and mitigating the risks, clinical trials as far as we possibly can in the state. Now that's a huge task, as I've mentioned, and one that within a contemporary cancer centre there would be hopefully the resources that would drive that and enable that to happen. So that's, again, an aspirational goal.
So talking about this vision you have for building a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre here in Western Australia, in Perth, we're talking about a place where it is like a one-stop shop. So a patient can come in, all of their diagnosis, treatment plans, tests, screening, all the medical service that they require, all in the same place.
Yep.
An advocate who will help guide and keep track of all of those appointments, the holistic care, the pain management, the physio, the gym, the music therapy, all in one place, and the integration of research so that that is part of the treatment plan and the clinical trials. That's the model you're saying. It exists, I think there's about 55 of them in the UK, 500 in the US, and in Australia, where else do we have this?
So, as I mentioned, many of you will know about the Peter McCallum Centre in Melbourne, which is a world-class centre. It's again about 80 years old, very established, and for any of you who might have visited Melbourne recently, you would have seen this incredible building which houses this beautiful centre. Why is it world-class? It has 42 different research groups right next to and embedded into the clinical care. They have radiotherapy, they have imaging, they have theatres, all the things we've been talking about. And the model, I mean, this is a model that's been tried and tested around the world. And what we're talking about here is to take the best bits of all these models and put them together into what we would design and hopefully bring to fruition, which would be our version, as it were, the West Australian version of a contemporary comprehensive cancer centre with all the things you've just described. And with key goals: better journey, way better journey, less fragmentation, access to the best clinical trials infrastructure in the world, fantastic discovery research, and the best care. It's really important to understand recruiting people into Western Australia is challenging. We're not London, we're not Texas, and we're not Boston, and so we have to have the best infrastructure. And what I mean by that is the best place to do this sort of work. We have to have a critical mass of people who are passionate, committed, want to working fiercely to improve the outcomes for people with cancer. So this is a long-term, bold vision for this town.
And it has had some progress.
Yep, and this has been going for quite some time. Many of you will know that the Prime Minister, previous, ScoMo, came over to Western Australia, and prior to that we'd written, that is the Perkins had written to Greg Hunt, who was the previous Health Minister, and we said to Minister Hunt, we think that we could put together a terrific contemporary comprehensive cancer centre here in Perth, and we provided some ideas for the funding of that, and ScoMo came over here on the 28th of May in 2022 and announced $375 million for a Western Australian contemporary comprehensive cancer centre. And so that's very exciting. And there was quite a fanfare and various things. And that was deposited, as it were, with the goal of it being matched by the state government. And many of you will know that we are working very closely with the state government to hopefully bring that vision to fruition. There's a lot of work going on at the present time, a business case being developed, etc., that's going to take quite a long time to sort through. But it's an opportunity tonight to share the vision with you about what we're really talking about, and which certainly captured the interest of the federal government 2 years ago. It also captured the interest of the current Prime Minister and Minister for Health, Mark Butler and Albo, and they've sort of after ScoMo was removed from office, as it were, it was very important for us to have the support from the Albanese government, and there is support for this concept. At the same time, across Australia, the last election where ScoMo was replaced by Albo, at the same time, 3 new comprehensive or contemporary comprehensive cancer centres were born, as it were, in the same election. One in Queensland, right next to Royal Brisbane Hospital and the Berghofer Institute. One in South Australia, next to Royal Adelaide Hospital and the Proton Therapy and the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, and one here. And in fact, the amount of funds that were provided by the ScoMo, by the Morrison government, was exactly the same amount as was given to the Queensland government. So, and those were to add to and complement the Peter Mac in Victoria and the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse in Sydney. So suddenly, Australia has, in 5 states, contemporary comprehensive cancer centres that are all growing. And that goal is to have a network that is really networked, as it were, to ensure that the best care is being delivered, the best communication is being delivered, the solutions that might be for how we provide equity to the most remote places in Western Australia, which is a huge task, how we might be able to understand how to do that better by talking to our colleagues in Queensland, by talking to them in Victoria, etc. So it was a momentous time when you think about it for this country, because suddenly there's the potential to have 5 linked, networked, contemporary comprehensive cancer centres all talking to each other in a way that's never happened before, and that's really exciting. And add that to the release of the National Cancer Plan by Dorothy Keefe, who reports to the Minister for Health in Canberra late last year, where a central tenet of that whole plan relates to the development of contemporary comprehensive cancer centres across Australia. So it's an exciting time, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to share this vision with you all, because things are changing. It's exciting.
Some very quick fire questions for public and private patients.
If we look across the models, and there are many different models, and we're a long way away from thinking about those in real terms, but the goal, of course, would be able to provide the cancer services to both the public and the private sector. How that might work, how it's going to be constructed, lots of discussions. It's going to take many months, I should say, many months to work through that as part of the thinking through a cognate business case that's being worked on by us and very closely with the Department of Health at the present time, and that's working very well.
And what about current cancer centres, oncologists practicing now? Obviously, there are many in Perth and in Western Australia. There's a comprehensive cancer centre by name in Charlie's. How will all that work? How will you integrate? Because we're not going to be able to fit everyone in the same one big building. No. How will it work?
Look, I think great question. How that will integrate is unclear right now. I mean, obviously, the people vote with their feet. We look at the new Chris O'Brien and other centres around the world. It's a mixture of both local. For example, if I look at Calgary, there is a cancer centre in the hospital right next door. The whole cancer centre is going to be picked up and moved. So there's one model. in the Chris O'Brien Lifehouse over in Sydney. In that model, part of the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, the RPA next door, was moved in. There are many different ways of slicing and dicing this, and that level of detail hasn't been worked out, other than to say that if you look at the people who want to be involved with these contemporary comprehensive cancer centres, they're very similar in goals. They are youngish clinicians who are passionate about research being the foundation for the delivery of high quality care, and they want to make a difference and do that within a centre where there is being the best people in the world being recruited, because there's all the infrastructure in the world. You can do and give your patients the best care within quaternary centres, within these contemporary comprehensive cancer centres. So it's really exciting if you think about it. If you've got all the right infrastructure, you can just deliver care in a different way than we currently do, and that's super exciting. I'm looking at Ben Morton now, and many of you may know Ben. So Ben is now on the Perkins board, but previously he was absolutely central to getting the Morrison government to commit $375 million to a Western Australian comprehensive cancer centre, because Ben was the minister assisting the Prime Minister and worked very closely with Greg Hunt, who was the previous Minister for Health, and with Michaelia Cash, and the two of you were essentially involved. So a huge shout out to you, Ben, and Michaelia, because without your hard work and understanding the complexities of the politics, we wouldn't be in this position where there are some funds dedicated to a West Australian Comprehensive Cancer Centre. So, big shout out to you and thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Happy to answer any question.
With the linear clinical trials, what type of cancer are they doing, please?
Yeah. Look, it's bring it on, all, as far as I'm aware. I don't know all the details, but essentially it's been spread across many different types of cancer. We have several different specialists. We have several oncologists, some medical, solid tumour doctors, as well as we have a whole lot of people who are involved in blood-borne cancers like leukemia and lymphoma. They're about equal, as far as I understand, within the facility. Very excitingly, and soon to be commissioned, and it's not formally announced yet, we, through the state government, have been able to reconfigure the ground floor of B Block at Charlie's, just 5 minutes walk away, and there's a brand new cancer centre that's just getting going that has about 18 chairs/beds, and it's dedicated to early phase cancer. So currently it's been mixed in linear, and this is a brand new facility. It's actually beautiful.
When it's formally commissioned, this new premises, this new clinical trials, wouldn't that be an opportunity for big public announcement, and the second part of that would be to invite people onto trials? Why are people resistant to going onto trials at linear?
Right.
Do you know that?
So good question. Two part. There will be a substantial opening with appropriate ministerial presence, but that's not yet, but it will be. And the second question is, it's complex for why there's only 5 to 6% of people on clinical trials with cancer. It's mainly around entry into the trial, and a lot of people who are having various therapies, they've got abnormalities, for example, in their blood counts, and their kidney function, their liver function, that tend to be preventive. They may already have been on a medication that actually interferes with it. All I know is it's just very complicated, and everyone's trying incredibly hard to increase that number. And in fact, in the UK, one of their key performance indicators, or KPIs, is in fact the number of patients, the proportion of patients on clinical trials, where everyone's trying to increase them, of course, but at the same time you're trying the drug company who's manufacturing the medicine, they're trying to mitigate their risk as well. So it's very challenging. It is not, and it's the pharmaceutical industry is definitely working with us. This is definitely not anything to suggest they're not working, proactively to increase the number of patients in clinical trials. But they're quite demanding, and of course, it is first in human. It's really, truly first in human here in Western Australia. I mean, there's nothing like this in Australia, nothing. Peter Mac does a huge number of phase 2 and 3 clinical trials, but much less phase 1. There are, there are clocks everywhere through it. You're locked in. You can't get out. Everything is controlled because the drug company or biotech industry company that's generated the medicine, to get it into phase 1 trials, it's years of work and usually tens of millions of dollars. Phase 1, 2, 3, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars by the time it gets out of that funnel. So the facility, Linear, has to have brilliant standard operating procedures to make sure it does everything brilliantly and as safely as humanly possible to mitigate risk to the patient and to the companies and to Linear, obviously. It's a really good question, and we think about it a lot.
I'm curious if there's any research that quantifies the improved outcome for a patient who does undergo a clinical trial. So that, to me, would be the most convincing thing if somebody said, you're going to have a 50% improved chance. Is there something that says that in figures or not?
So pretty much most clinical trials end up being published. And so when you finish phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3, and they get published in more and more prestigious journals. Typically phase 3 trials involve, for a blood pressure medication, for example, it could be thousands. In cancer, it could be 100 or so patients, and they might come from several different places around the world. If that trial's successful, it'll be published, and so the data is already there. The success rate, the improvement in outcome, and outcomes measured in many different ways. It might be disease-free time. It could be true mortality. There are many different variables that are measured, but successful outcomes are published, and it's a really important part of making sure that people are aware. And it could be a phase 2 trial that then goes on to phase 3. The successful phase 2 trial will be published because everyone therefore understands that it may not be far from phase 3, and can we recruit into phase 3 some of our own patients. You don't have to be in the one centre. It can be distributed around the world. So I think we're all very, 1, collaborative, 2, transparent, and 3, wanting to make sure that the results of the trials are made as public as soon as humanly possible. That's the way we do business. That's a great question.
Alan, did you have a question?
So, look, as a potential beneficiary of a comprehensive cancer centre, would have been good to have it 6 months ago. And you've talked about government interest. Is there similar interest from the private sector in WA to establish such a centre?
Well, that's a really good question. What is clear is that there's an appetite, but it hasn't yet. But the conversations that relate to that appetite haven't really been finalised in real terms. And I think the process here is there's some funds from the federal government, which were generously donated to Western Australia to generate and establish a comprehensive cancer centre. We're very keen to work, and we are working very closely with the state government, and in the hope that there may be a one-for-one for that. And it was very clearly outlined when these funds came to Western Australia. There has been great interest in other centres like this by the private sector. Chris O'Brien, substantial funds from the private sector, tens of millions of dollars. And the Peter Mac gets on an ongoing basis through its fundraising substantial private sector involvement. So I think it's a bit of a convoluted answer, but the answer is yes. But that's further down the track in real terms. But we envisage that there'll be substantial interest.
Hi, my name's
Hello.
Jan Eccles. In a previous life, I did do some research into asbestosis and mesothelioma, but that's by the by. I'm interested in your 375 million. How firm is that from the federal government? And where is it exactly?
I should-
Is it in is it bearing interest? Is it virtual? Is it going to be paid to us when WA matches? Is it incremented? Is it a change in government every 3 years? I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
it
No,
just
that's a great
is not
question.
really firm. Thanks.
I might pass over to Ben in a moment, but my understanding, because... essentially, it was actually a very interesting time because, of course, it was in the budget that ScoMo passed, but the election happened before the federal budget was formally passed, as far as I'm aware. But despite that, it was in the budget forward projections, and then it was in the budget that Albo put together. And so it was in both of those in the budget papers. Question would be, and I think this is a really interesting one, and I have no way of knowing what might be the case. There's 2 elections early next year. There's a state election, there's a federal election. And could the Albanese government say, we don't want to fund this anymore? Well, I suppose it's possible. You'd hope that wouldn't be the case, given everything I've just said in the last 40 minutes, that there's every reason for Western Australia to benefit from the generosity of the federal government rather than take it away.
Ben, as a former federal government minister, can you give us the workings of these commitments, please?
I'm used to addressing cynicism when it comes to politicians, so the question hasn't surprised me, and it's a good question. When the Prime Minister Morrison came here to Perkins, that was after a process in the federal budget to consider the Perkins proposal. It was a proposal that was taken to the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet by Greg Hunt, and Peter talked about the other funding commitments that were made around the country. So the money was announced in the budget as part of the budget. It wasn't an election commitment. It wasn't a promise. It was a very important thing from our point of view that it wasn't. While it was announced before the budget, and the budget actually was before the election, Peter, it wasn't anything to do with the election itself, and so the money is there. What really pleased me, not so much my side of politics losing the election, but the fact that these things are not partisan, these things are not political. The money that was put into the federal budget by the previous Liberal government has been kept in the budget by the current Labor government, and I'm really pleased and thankful for Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, that money has remained there. But I'm also equally pleased that the state government is supporting their consideration of how they may be able to support the Perkins initiative by funding Perkins to go through a business case process, which is now being run, and Peter's very involved in as well. So I think it's right that the state government is looking really carefully about how they can commit to cancer services in this state, given that they're currently running the public health system. So I'm very optimistic there, and Peter probably spoke more politically than I did. I think it'd be a very courageous government or opposition that suggests that the 375 million that's in the budget for Western Australia would ever get taken away from Perkins or for a comprehensive cancer centre here in WA as well.
Thank you.
Professor Peter, how much money do you actually need to start with this cancer centre, which is obviously really necessary?
That's a great question. What could you build with 375 million? What could you build with 750? What could you build with $1 billion? I'm repeatedly being told it's likely to cost $1 billion. What I'm keen to do is to actually get the numbers, capacity, so forward. There's a lot of modelling going on at the present time about numbers and potential capacity requirements. So rather than talk about numbers of dollars, I'm much keener on actually getting the data on what we might need as a state, and then thinking around what's the capacity needs, and then how can we value add to that throughout a building. So it's a really good question, but all I know is that Peter Mac was 1.1 billion some years ago. The Calgary, which is pretty big, was 1.5 billion when I was there a little while ago. So they're all pretty big and pricey. But right now, I don't want in any way commit to anything because we're in the middle of doing a business case, and there's a lot of work to be done. To really address your question, it would be sometime early next year.
I'm loving hearing this. I think it's an exciting opportunity, and we are. I think most of us have been through a journey of some description. That's why we're here for a lot of the time, and we haven't had this sort of facility which, as part of an end user, if you'd like to call it that, and being an advocate for someone who went through this journey, I think this is really exciting. What I'm really interested in knowing is, from an end user's perspective, and I'm not sure what the medical term is, or a patient's perspective, what sort of consultative process is that amongst the people who are actually going to be using that? Because you clearly have all the expertise of what we need, but we're the people who will potentially go through it or have been through it, and some have had really great experiences, some have had appalling experiences, and I agree our facilities here are great and the level of care can be great. Yeah. But what sort of consultative process of the average Joe Blow, what is happening there to help guide these decisions? Because I went through that as an advocate, and we were told what we should be having, and it didn't necessarily mean that it was the correct thing for us. Yeah. So, and look, I know this is probably down the track because you are at the beginning of this journey, and I understand that. But I do think it's important to have some sort of process in place, and I'm sure you do, but I'd like to hear about it and the extent to that and how you identify those people across all sorts of disciplines. The discipline that we were involved in landed up was one, and then it was like multidisciplinary. And our primary one hasn't even been mentioned tonight, and I get that. There are so many different types of cancer in that.
That's a great question. So the philosophy is it's going to be incredibly consultative. That's the philosophy. And it has to be a cultural buy-in in real terms. There has been some consultation early on, but there's going to be a whole lot more over the next 12 to 18 months. And that means that's across all disciplines, including Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders and people from the rural and remote areas. So you can be absolutely comforted in the fact that it'll be highly consultative, highly collaborative going forward. And I think we'll hear a lot more about this whole entity going forward, and there'll be some great discussions. And I'm incredibly committed to that.
Shelley Moira has a question here.
Peter, thank you so much. And just building on a previous question, you talked about your trip to Calgary, and Calgary is a very large province, and how well networked that they were. How do you see, having done the walk on the weekend and seen all these people in the Perkins community, every single one of them had a reason. They had a reason for being there. And we're a very big state. Building on the question about consultation, how do you see the network building across the state? How can this facility here impact someone in Kununurra, someone in Albany, someone in wherever? How do you see that coming together?
Yeah. So look, to some extent, I've sort of mentioned a little bit of this a bit earlier on. It has to be a wonderful opportunity to value add, but also take some leadership in real terms. And if you've got the right culture and the right leadership, and where it's understood that there's a big problem, and it needs substantial resources put into it. No one's been able to solve, unfortunately, this issue. That doesn't mean to say you can't confront it and come up with better ideas. So, because what we want is to reduce that at least 2 times mortality rate for people who are outside, who have cancer outside. So I think that a lot of this relates to on-the-ground presence and skills on the ground, and again, that takes time to build those up, and you might do this in a very sort of stochastic way where you start small and build up the capacity. There's already very good tele-oncology. There's hardly any tele-clinical trials, as you know. So I think that have big aspirational goals, have the right culture, understand the nature of the provision of resources. For example, there's been some really interesting thinking about using sophisticated technology that will, and AI to some extent, to reduce the need for travel and have much better, for example, diagnostics on the ground in remote areas. But then who's going to run them and what infrastructures to provide there? So these don't have the answers, but certainly leadership of a sort of hub and spoke concept across the sector is the only way to go. And embrace new technologies, and I'm very keen on new technologies and how they may help us come through some of these solutions.
We are really getting close to the end of time, but coming off the back of that, I'm wondering, having heard you talk at so many layers to this, from the patient journey, the patient experience and how that could be improved, from the integration of research, multidisciplinary teams, from diagnosis through treatment, through to whether the $375 million is going to disappear. What comes to my mind is perhaps the need for public advocacy and people here spreading the word and contacting their local MP and writing letters and saying that this is something that Western Australians deserve to have. If it's really coming to fruition in other states, it already exists in Victoria and in New South Wales, Queensland's on the way, South Australia. Perhaps to wrap up, that's what we're talking about. All the different layers of this are very complex, but at the simple level, the public might be really a driving force.
No, absolutely. And there's an imperative to some extent that why Western Australia needs this in real terms. Very simply, it needs it to be a flagship, and we need to be part of it, support it, be proud of it, and ring the bells and join what is a wonderful Australian network and an international network, singing from the same songbook, improving outcomes and moving cure into care.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing your vision tonight. I hope it all came together in the end for everyone to sort of get a sense of where this might be going. So thank you so much for your sharing of all the different elements of this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Miriam.